Good evening. £38,700. That is the salary that will be needed to qualify for a skilled worker visa, an increase of almost 50% on the current level. Those coming on health and social care visas will be exempt, but care workers from abroad who are exempt from salary restrictions will no longer be allowed to bring dependent partners or children. Also in the government's five-part plan, the occupations and the government's shortage occupations list, which allows people to come to the UK on lower wages, is being reduced. At the moment, it encompasses artists and musicians as well as construction workers and carpenters, 38 occupations in all. But what's to say these restrictions will drive up growth? We'll hear from Ben in a moment. But what are the politics of all this and whether it will excite the electorate?
But we're tackling migration. It does usually mean they've run out of ideas, but it is true that they've been ignoring the democratic will of the electorate. They've ignored the fact that people do want immigration to come down, and they have stood on platforms of bringing immigration down whilst failing to bring immigration down. There is a democratic deficit that's at play here, a continual democratic deficit that's at play here. But I think that the reasons they have for continuing migration are ones of economic prosperity. We want to have increasing growth. We want to have increasing population size. We want to fulfill the gaps in our labour market that aren't being filled by the current workforce, especially considering what's happened elsewhere in our economy. There are plenty of failures on immigration policy, whether you want the numbers to go up or down, or whether you think they failed in making sure that they provide enough public service funding to be able to turn that growth in the economy into the kind of infrastructure that's necessary to support the population increase. There are plenty of positions that you can stay on that particular spectrum of opinion. Regardless of where you lie there, people do want to vote to bring immigration down, and they've not done that. But their choice of the way in which they want to actually bring it down, that's what we need to scrutinise. Say, oh, well, you can only come here if you're this rich, which actually isn't good migration policy. It's not good migration policy to have for higher wages for British nationals, for example. Because then if you're just importing a load of people who have high salaries, all you're doing is driving down the salaries of the people who currently exist in that very specific sector of the economy. You're increasing the supply of labour in skilled work, so it drives down the wages of skilled work for everybody. On top of the fact that you'd have more positions available for skilled work if the economy grew by having more labour force everywhere in the economy. It's like these points-based immigration systems don't actually help British nationals in the way that people claim that they do. Because it doesn't increase the size of the economy greatly if you reduce migration that much. All you're doing is increasing the labour pool for skilled labour. So that makes skilled labour less valuable overall in the economy. So it's a very silly policy that people seem to support because they think that it will increase their wages when it does the opposite.
On immigration, we will be seeing quite soon the Home Secretary James Cleverly in Kigali signing a new treaty with Rwanda. That visit could be happening as early as tomorrow. I understand that will involve extra costs, that's extra legal support for Rwanda. I'm told that that's a practical cost. That's not Rwanda saying this is the price we demand to put our signature on this new treaty. So a big focus tomorrow on illegal migration, but today the focus was on bringing down legal migration. An election looming and a Prime Minister struggling to make the political weather. Time to move on an issue vexing his voters.
Migration to this country is far too high and needs to come down.
Is that the thing, is that they keep saying, oh, well, the issue that we have is that people are coming into the labour force to undercut workers, right? The biggest sector of legal migrants coming to this country is students. They're people coming here to study. That's an export, right? They're bringing foreign capital into the country to spend on our institutions, right? So essentially we're exporting education whilst bringing these people in to become consumers in our economy as well. So that's just immediately positive for growth for everybody because they're bringing money in, increasing the size of the economy without actually contributing to the labour force overall, right? But that doesn't really matter that they're not being productive because they're bringing their capital with them. But they're also consuming, driving up the demand for products across the economy, but with the extra capital that they're bringing, therefore making the economy larger for more people to have jobs elsewhere. And then what's also great about these people is that once they finish studying, they're going to leave. They just come here, buy a bunch of our products, give us a bunch of their money, and then they go away again. So that's actually a really big economic benefit when students are coming over as part of the high levels of legal immigration. And then the second is, of course, nurses, care workers, people in the healthcare sector, which is already sectors of the economy that we have a shortfall of workers for. So they're also really highly contributing, right? All of these nonsense about foreigners coming here and staying on benefits, which they can't do, right? You need national insurance receipts and you need to be here for 3 years, right? Like, none of these are things that immediate migrants are going to have access to. It's just a bunch of nonsense. I mean, it's always economically beneficial, right? And you may say, right, because the other side of this argument would be, well, I don't really care if they're economically beneficial. I don't really care if they're giving us a net benefit to the economy, because I don't want cultural change. I don't want there to be more people who aren't British nationals here because they might change the culture of the country. I disagree with that point, right? But what you can't do is reconcile that with your belief in there needing to be more economic growth, right? You can't have both of those positions because they're counteracting each other. If you are an older person, say, and you want somebody to pay your pension, you're going to want the overall size of the economy to increase as we demographically age and as our worker base becomes a lot smaller, because people aren't having enough babies and we don't have replacement level births in this country, right? It's your choice, right? If you want to make us economically poorer to maintain some kind of cultural identity that you think is being undermined by immigration, you're well within your right to vote for that stuff. But just understand what it is specifically that you're voting for. Because you can't just hold this position of continual increasing pension provision, continual increasing economic growth, continually increasing prosperity, whilst having these low birth rates that we currently have, whilst also having low migration, right? It's up to you.
A 5-point plan to cut legal migration by 300,000. First, reduce the number of family members accompanying care workers by raising the annual immigration health surcharge by 66%. Raise the skilled workers earning threshold to just under 39,000 from just over 26,000 to prevent the undercutting of British workers. Health and care workers will be exempt.
I mean, I was going to say, the thing that's undercutting British workers is this policy right here. The 20% salary discount, deliberate policy to undercut people. They're literally undercutting people through policy, right? Labour markets don't work in the way they're saying, by having like a salary like threshold for what they come here, right? If they're going to come here and increase the labour pool in a certain sector, regardless of what their existing salary is, they're going to devalue the existing workforce unless there's a massive labour shortage in that particular sector. So instead of having a specific wage, which they come here, just have general migration, and they'll usually fulfill the same kind of roles demographically that the existing population does, right? They're not going to all filter into a single sector, but they're now more likely to do that because we've stopped people coming in from a certain particular wage threshold in this country, right? Again, you're not undercutting British workers, but what you are is increasing the labour pool for specifically skilled workers rather than those throughout the economy. Right. This is why this points-based immigration system is really, really dumb.
Scrap the 20% salary discount for jobs where there are deemed to be a shortage of workers. Only allow independents if overseas workers earn just under 39,000, up from nearly 19,000. And finally...
So what that's going to do is that's going to decrease the number of people who can come to do the jobs who are below that salary threshold, right? Because if you can't bring a family, you're just not going to come here, half the time at the very least.
View the graduate route to prevent abuse.
This is the largest reduction on record. Immigration policy must be fair, consistent, legal, and sustainable.
The previous Prime Minister was accused of being a shopping trolley, veering around from one side to the other. The current Prime Minister is clearly veering, but he certainly isn't steering. He's just climbed into someone else's shopping trolley and he's being pushed around all over the place.
Mixed reactions on both sides of the Tory party.
It's a really welcome and positive step, and I'm really delighted to see it. I'm glad that some of the points the New Conservatives have been pushing were adopted by the Home Secretary, and appreciate the outreach he's given to us in order to hear ideas, as well as listening quite clearly to the Immigration Minister, who's been fighting from within, from what we can see.
Well, what's going on here is that there is an argument between the political headline of take back control and dramatically reduce legal migration and the reality on the ground of what that means to people who look after mum, people who look after dad when they're sick or when they're diagnosed with dementia and have to go into care. And really, it'll depend on which one of those two wins out in constituencies up and down the country, won't it?
And that's what's important, right? At least somebody in the Tory party is being, like, actually realistic about what this means, right? It's a choice, and you got to make that choice. You can't have one or the other. Unfortunately, the right-wing press say you can stop immigration and have all of the good things you, as a Tory voter, want. Well, that's true, right? They do just continually get lied to by the press about just how, like, labour markets work and how the economy works. And that's the problem. That's the problem, right? They've been essentially told forever a massive pack of mistruths about what they can or can't have, right? I said, if you want to lower our level of population, right? If you want to lower our immigration numbers, right? Fair enough, right? You're going to have to start shagging unless you want economic decline, right? Better get busy making some babies. Otherwise, you'll have continued economic decline. It's up to you. It's up to you. What's also ironic as well is that the people who are going to most need these people who are coming from overseas to do things like care work and work in the nursing sector, for example, are the ones who are the most likely to vote against these kind of policies or bringing these people in. Because it's mostly older people who are preferring of there being lower immigration. And they're the ones who will need, most of all, people to come and work in the care sector, to come and work in the NHS. They're the ones who use it, the vast majority. And on top of that, they're the ones whose pensions are getting paid by the Exchequer. And the Exchequer has a certain amount of funding that it can put in based upon the productive capacity of the economy, which won't go up if we restrict immigration too much, whilst also having below replacement birth rates.
Today's announcement is a significant political moment, but there's an important economic story behind these plans too. Ben's here. Well, what will this do to the economy?
Well, one signal, Kirsty, comes from business groups, and tonight they are not happy. They are saying these restrictions will be bad for UK growth. So let's consider the minimum salary threshold for recruiting skilled workers from abroad. Now, businesses accepted that this did need to rise from its current level, the blue line, of around £26,200, given that wages, as you can see in the red line, have risen higher than that level. But look where it's going to, £38,700, considerably above the rate of wage inflation. And businesses are looking at this and saying this is going to make it really difficult for them to fill really important gaps in the labour market now.
But what about the health and social care sector?
It's also worth pointing out as well, right? Like, I know that I talk in, like, Marxist terminology a lot of the time, and, like, the conflict between workers and bosses, right? And I don't stop believing this because I'm making this point, right? But on something like immigration, just because businesses like it doesn't mean that it's bad for workers. In fact, just growing the size of the economy is good for everybody because everybody benefits from increased growth if you have sufficient levels of distribution and redistribution within the economy, right? Just because businesses like it that foreign workers are coming in doesn't mean it's because that they're depressing your wages. It's just they have more people there to consume their products, right? If you have good labour laws, if you have good labour market control by the government, if you have good labour policy, and if you have strong unions, you can protect wages completely across the board, continue to grow the economy. Businesses will still have growth, and your wages will go up and your standard of living will increase. That's just a thing that you can do, which makes it incredibly ironic that Labour are the ones absolutely banging on about growing the economy, whilst full-throatedly backing the policies that are being proposed here. Literally, Steve Reid was on Sophie Ridge last night, talking about how they liked this new policy and they probably would implement it themselves, which just shows the kind of people who Rachel Reeves is governing for. You know, we're going to be having plenty of unlimited immigration as far as bankers are concerned, but people below that threshold, like normal working people, nah mate, no family whatsoever, not allowed. But if you want to come and marry a banker from overseas, fine, not a problem.
Well, as you heard, they have been exempted from this particular salary threshold. And given how many health and social care visas have been issued in recent years, you can perhaps understand why the government has taken that decision. Yet the restrictions on dependents of people with visas coming in has still caused alarm about the knock-on impacts of that to the health and social care sector. let's look at this for context. This is the amount of vacancies in health and social care. You can see extremely high still, 179,000 vacancies. That's the context. But what's the even bigger picture? Well, James Cleverly, the Home Secretary today, said that net migration last year of about 745,000 would have been around 300,000 lower had these restrictions been in place. Yet, and many will see that as a positive thing, yet it is worth noting that the Office of Budget Responsibility actually upgraded its recent growth forecast for the UK on the back of higher than expected net migration. So we can see here, these are estimates from Jonathan Portes, the economist, looking at what the OBR has now predicted, and he estimates that the OBR thinks that the labour force in the UK will now be around 1.5% larger because of that net migration, and that in turn leads on to an economy, GDP, which is around £40 billion larger, and that leads to tax revenues which are around £18 billion larger. Now look, the economy is not everything when it comes to this issue, and of course it's worth noting that governments have to take consideration many other things, and
It's exactly what I was saying. Literally, it just makes the economy larger for everybody. It increases the productive capacity, which again is going to be necessary because we have a demographic aging problem where we're going to have far more people who are going to be on pensions comparatively as a ratio of our population compared to those who are being productive. And the amount at which you're going to be able to provide in terms of pension provision is going to be in some way proportional to the productive capacity of the economy, which is shrinking, right? Yet the people who are living on pensions is increasing. So that is a demographic ticking time bomb, both in terms of pension provision and in terms of the amount of social care. And we have huge gaps in terms of overall productive capacity and the people who are going to be working in that social care sector, right? It's just not, this doesn't work. It literally does not work, right? And the people who are going to lose out are the ones who are voting for it.
The Immigration Advisory
But we're trying
Committee,
to get growth into the economy.
they do have to consider that, but the Immigration Advisory Committee did recommend some of the measures that they've implemented today, such as getting rid of the 20% going rate salary discount for shortage occupations. But nevertheless, Kirsty, tonight many businesses are asking for some honesty from the government on the impacts of these decisions and some honesty as well on the trade-offs when it comes to curbing immigration.
Thanks very much indeed.
It's worth pointing out as well, right? It just shows you who it is that you can actually trust with migration. It's not the Conservatives, right? Because not only are the Conservatives the one who promised to bring down immigration and then never did, they're also the ones who are literally rigging the policy to ensure that it actually is undercutting wages, right? By having this 20% discount in place, right? They are literally deliberately crafting policy to undercut your wages. Whereas you could literally have the same policy whilst promising to actually not have these migration controls, right? And then get rid of the bad policy, which is the wage undercut, and nobody would notice, right? Nobody would notice the fact that immigration is high if you just ran on a platform of not actually having a control over it and having as many people coming in as you need to, which is essentially the Green and Lib Dem position on this one, whilst ensuring that you don't have these negative labour market effects. But the Tories have not only increased the level of migration, they have also deliberately made sure that you can get undercut by them. It just shows you who doesn't care about working class people, who doesn't actually care about working people, regardless of background, regardless of which country regardless of their country of origin. The Tories are very happy to bring in migrants as long as they can use it to undercut your wages. Incredible.
Well, now we're joined by Christina McAnea, the General Secretary of Unison, the largest trade union in the care sector, Richard Tice, the leader of the Reform Party, and from Parliament, Brendan Clark-Smith, Conservative MP, Deputy Chairman of the party. First of all, Christina McAnea, you've heard those figures there. The care sector is increasingly under pressure and will continue to be so, but the Home Secretary's statistics are quite clear. 110.
Also, before we start this debate, I find it frustrating, right? That whenever we have these discussions, we'll have people from the political divide on each side of the issue, right? So we have, this debate is specifically two right-wingers who are anti-migration debating a left-winger who is pro-migration. So we only hear certain perspectives of each side of the discussion, right, regardless of the merits of their arguments. Whereas you could have had Richard Tice and then a One Nation Tory on one side, and then you could have had like a union leader and then, I don't know, whoever the guy is who does Free Speech Nation on GB News, I've forgotten his name, but he's a left-wing anti-immigration type. And then you could get all of the perspective that's necessary here. But people who are watching these debates, because they're not really taking a lot of the facts until they watch me react to it live on YouTube, but they're mostly looking at this from the political perspective of whichever tribe that they belong to. And this entrenches those divides along political lines, as if the left is the pro-migration camp and the right is the anti-migration camp, when really there are arguments from both sides of varying levels of merit, right? Because I think both sides who are anti-migration both have really bad arguments, who don't have many merits on their side of the argument, right? But I'm far more willing to consider someone who's left-wing when it comes to their anti-migration opinions, mostly to have discussions with them about why they're wrong, because mostly belies a lack of understanding in how labour markets work, really and truly, right? Because I think most left-wingers who disagree with migration do so because they believe in bunk economics about reserve army of labour stuff, which really only applies to a static population, right? So women entering the workforce, that is reserve army of labour, but increasing the size of the workforce overall whilst increasing the population, now that isn't reserve army of labour economics, right? I think that's where the kind of the bunk economics where left-wing points come from, and I can discuss that, but you have right-wingers trying to discuss it from an economic perspective, where really, a lot of the time, it's just because they don't want brown people in the country. And it'll be interesting seeing a One Nation Tory coming on this side representing the right-wing, saying, well, no, look, right, there is actually a choice we made here, which is what the person already said earlier on in the 2 sentences they got to speak on the matter in the interview at the start of the programme.
1,000 care home workers from abroad with 120,000 dependents. Is that sustainable for any economy?
Well, I think it depends on what they're coming in for and whether the economy needs them or not. And clearly, this economy needs care workers to come in and health workers. And one of the ways that
The irony is that, yes, any economy can handle this stuff, right? It's literal simple demand-side economics. You increase the size of the population, supply will increase to meet that demand. But that's as long as you have a free market, as long as you have a market that's distributing those goods and services. If you don't have a market for that goods or a service, then you can't necessarily rely on the supply to increase to meet the demand. You can't rely on that to happen. So that's what we've seen happening with, for example, housing or public service provision. Public service provision, because it's been cut back by the government deliberately. Again, so people blame migrants rather than blame austerity, which is the actual problem here. And when it comes to housing, it's restricting planning that's happening here. NIMBY's stopping additional house building, which is keeping the housing supply too static, or too inelastic in comparison to the increasing population, so the supply isn't meeting that demand, right? The market isn't free enough in terms of the ability for supply to meet that demand, right? Like, you must think, you're a communist, the No Justice stream, talking about the benefits of free markets. I mean, I'm happy to understand the economics when it comes to it, right? My main issue is the ownership. Who owns the stuff? Who gets to make those decisions? Who gets to see the profits that come from whatever revenue is generated by those assets? Whether it should be collectively done or whether it should be done individually or privately. That's the crux of my argument here. But at the very least, if you're going to have this increase in population, you're going to have to take some of those economic gains from GDP that we've seen earlier and put that into extra public service provision. Otherwise, you're going to drive a wedge between the national community and the migrant community, which is literally what's happened, right? Where I literally, no joke, like when we first saw the Thames water stuff going on, you're more on that story later. Like, we were watching a Julia Hartley-Brewer segment, which is actually the big problem isn't the privatisation of water, it's the migrants coming here expecting water provision. And I'm like, why do you think that water provision hasn't met the demand? It's because there's not a market, there's not a free market, because the private ownership has a monopoly. They cannot bother investing in additional provision, because they know that they can just charge more, right? And of course, loads of other factors happen on top of that as well, right? But again, they will literally use any amount of failure of public provision of amenities as a way of which you can drive a wedge into immigration, when really the problem is no investment.
Attract them is by allowing them to bring in dependents.
But if those dependents are then, as it were, a drain on the economy through healthcare, through education, all these things, is that not a very difficult trade-off?
Well, it could be, but part of the problem we've got with today, Kirsty, is that there seems to be no impact assessment done. Some of the language used by James Cleverly was things.
And how are they a drain on the economy if they're coming here to work, therefore increasing the productive capacity, or if they're coming here because they are a student who is literally bringing in foreign capital, right? The only way they'd be a drain on the economy is if they were coming here and only claiming welfare. And even then, the welfare that they're claiming is going back into the economy anyway, thereby meaning they're actually very minimal in terms of the actual economic impact. Like the actual impact really and truly would be the level to which that they are using public services. But our public services are collapsing because we don't have enough funding for them, which an increase in GDP would give us more funding for, which they would get if they increased the productive capacity by coming here and working or by bringing in foreign capital. Like the basic framing of this argument is stupid.
Things like he said, we envisage, I suspect that. It was clear they had no real basis for this going forward. They hadn't done any real research on it. There was no evidence base to say what this would mean. It was like, stick your finger in there and see what actually happens as a result of
I really
this.
wish they would get any union leader who's not Christine McInerney. She's so rubbish. Oh, dear Lord. She's just not very good at what she does.
Let's look at a slightly different. Let's look at Scotland. There are fewer, as it were, immigrants in the care sector because they're paid better. Average pay differential is £900 a year. Would you like to see a higher salary for care workers to offset that idea that it has to be immigrants that help?
Absolutely. I mean, we have nothing against and we would support the government saying, let's grow our own care workers, let's support our own care workers. The big problem is they've consistently underfunded care. They have no strategy for care. Boris Johnson stood in the steps of Downing Street when he got elected and said, I've solved care, we've got a ready-made plan for it. I'm still waiting to see it. Nothing has been produced by the Tories for care. And instead of going after and trying to deal with the core problem, which is we have a care system which is cracking on its knees, not sustainable, they're going after the people who provide that care.
Except if today's reform encourage more people into the care sector domestically, wouldn't you be happy with that?
But why?
Where from? I pointed this out on Twitter last week, right? People continue this line of, well, if instead of getting immigrants in, why don't we just train up people from the British workforce who aren't working at the moment? Most of these people are too sick to work, right? Although I guess they can just work from home, apparently, according to people who really don't know what they're talking about, want to make it look like there's too many scroungers, right? Who want to drive a narrative rather than looking at the facts. Or they say, well, they can come out of the unemployment pool, right? At the time at which unemployment in October last year was at a 50-year low, right? The last time we had unemployment this low was in the 70s. There is no people to draw from to go into this sector from the domestic workforce, right? Or from a potential pool of domestic workforce. It's not there. We have massively low unemployment in this country. In fact, they keep bragging to us, the current government are bragging to us about how low unemployment is, yet people from their ideological ilk will come on and say, well, actually, what we really need to do is we need to train these people up to work. And I'm like, which people? We have a massively tight labour market. There are, tens of thousands of job vacancies and nobody here to fill them. And you think you can just pluck people out and go, you're becoming a care worker, you're becoming a nurse. First of all, whilst unemployment is low and the labour market is tight. And second of all, well, they're not even bothering giving these people a good enough wage to entice people to come and work there in the first place. It's fantasy economics from people who have an agenda to push and who do not really care about the facts.
In what sense would why would actually penalising care workers, existing migrant care workers, why would that encourage domestic labour to go in? The reason why they don't go in is because, well, it's a predominantly female workforce. Most of them earn minimum wage. They can earn more by going down the road to the local supermarket, and by that I mean they can earn £2, £3, £4 an hour more. I mean, you're a low-paid worker, that's a lot of money.
But Labour wants net migration down. Would Unison think that was a pursuit that is very laudable?
Not necessarily. I have to say, we don't have a major problem with migration as an issue. People coming in, they do essential jobs in our society. What we would like to see is more support being given to people who come into this country to actually make and to actually invest in training, pay, to encourage domestic labour to be able to take on some of these roles.
But just briefly, do you accept that public opinion is broadly in favour of reducing migration?
It probably is, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing. And if you look, like you, I'm Scottish. It's a country, smaller countries actually need migration to sustain their economy. The big worry about this, as I said, is they've done no assessment. They didn't speak to anyone in the sector. They haven't spoken to the Scottish or Welsh government. They've just plucked this out of the air as a sop to the right wing of their party without thinking about what the consequences would be for the country.
Let me put that...
That's literally true, right? Again, they are trying to meet public opinion whilst not being truthful with them, right? They're not being truthful with the population about the consequences of what reducing immigration would be. Because they know that they can't do it, right? Because they rely a bunch on the anti-immigration rhetoric to win elections. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, unfortunately. And also they need to train people to do the same standards which cost money when there's already a ready-made workforce via immigration. I mean, that is true, right? But loads of people would use that as an argument for then not putting money into training when we should have a bunch of money for training, right? We should have more training available, more people available to want to invest in the country to get these people into these sectors, right? To get people wanting to invest in these sectors because of the workforce we have available for it, right? But of course you are right indeed. It's much easier and cheaper to do that for the overall economy as well. Another thing that's cheaper, talking about being a drain on the economy. You know what's a drain on the economy? Children. Children are a drain on the economy because they are unproductive, right? Increasing the population through immigration is better for the economy than having more children because you don't have to spend 18 years providing for them being unproductive. They come here and start being productive immediately. It's great. Literally cost-free. That's why they are so much shown to by research to contribute more than they take out, because they spend more of their life within the country being economically active and productive. You spot on there the amount of care workers you've heard use the I can stack shelves for money and less responsibility line, and they do, yep, 100%, right? Like, they're just massively underpaid. Again, they keep saying, oh, well, where are all our care workers going? Why can't people from the domestic workforce work in these sectors? Because you don't pay them enough, right? We literally, again, have this massive understaffing issue in the NHS because they have a recruitment and retention crisis. Because why on earth would you become a nurse when your pay is rubbish in comparison to what you could be earning elsewhere? And it's massively stressful because of the huge gaps in the actual staffing levels, in the actual workforce gaps, meaning that everybody's doing more work than they should be for the same crappy pay. So yeah, of course they have a recruitment and retention crisis because it doesn't pay the bills.
To Brendan Clark-Smith. Brendan Clark-Smith, this is not about, and you heard it from Ben there, business is not happy. The OBR was factoring in migration as it stands to add 40 billion to the economy and 18 billion to the tax revenues. This is actually not about economics. It's about playing to what you think your voters want.
Well, this is like Brexit all over again, isn't it? Driving down wages, and you've just heard from a trade union. It did used to be the time that they would defend British interests, British workers, talk about training local people, talk about paying people more. And it's not just about bringing people in so everything's cheaper all the time. And as you've already said, whenever you bring one of these lower paid workers over, if they bring dependents, then they need schools, they need healthcare, they may have elderly dependents themselves. So there is an actual real cost with that migration.
Yeah, maybe you should have been investing in healthcare. You're literally in government, under-investing in these things and go, well, nothing that we can do about all of this additional demand. Guess you're going to have to deal with terrible public services. That's your fault. You did that. You literally did that by underfunding these services. Despite all the economic gains of the increased population size, you didn't put that back into public services, did you? No. You two were too busy giving bungs to the private sector to inflate asset prices through quantitative easing whilst implementing austerity on the rest of us.
as well. Now, of course, we do want the brightest and the best. We do want students to come here and study. That's another example of where the dependence visa really, we think, has been abused. And at the end of the day, it's got to be paid for.
So it doesn't matter. Again, you're just disregarding the OBR. It doesn't matter what the OBR says.
Well, it's not disregarding, really. I mean, if you actually look at who are the ones who are adding value to the economy, it is those skilled workers who are coming in. It is the students who are paying the fees coming in. We're talking about dependents. And dependence, if we're not actually making some sort of net gain here, there's a serious discussion to be had about the social cost that also comes with that as well. So, of course, we want to grow the economy.
There you go. Literally, it's about social cost, right? It's about social cost. Then there is the problem, right? Because even if the students are bringing in dependents, again, those are dependents. They're not people who are British nationals. They're not claiming benefits, right? They may be using public services, but that's what all of the money that's coming in, all of the money that these foreign people have got as students to be able to pay all of these fees, throwing foreign capital into our economy, right? Which they are paying tax revenues on. And then the institution themselves are then also paying that for procurement and things, which they're also going to have to pay tax on, could go into funding the public services necessary to be able to deal with the increase in population size, right? Whatever money, the foreign capital that they're using to pay their student fees is also the same capital that they're then using on their dependents as well, right? These dependents are either working themselves to be able to fund themselves, their own money, right? Which would then get taxed, and then would also be extra productivity, increasing the size of the economy and increasing tax revenues to be able to fund those public services, to be able to deal with the increase in population size. Or they are not working, but they're living off of the money that's coming from the student who has the money to come and study from abroad, right? In which case it's foreign capital, therefore continuing increasing the size of the economy. It's just the economics of this just does not work from these people's perspective. But of course, he's talking about the social cost, right? And again, you can have that position, right? I'm not saying that position is necessarily a wrong position to hold, right? I fundamentally disagree in a bunch of the social cost stuff that he's saying, right? I fundamentally disagree with what he's saying here, right? But it's a reasonable and absolutely fine opinion for you to be able to hold. You can have that opinion. But what you can't do is try and bullshit me with your fake nonsense economics about how the economics works on this to be able to cover up the fact that you just don't want brown people in the country, right? Or you don't want cultural or social change, right? Which is their usual euphemism for that.
But at the same time, you cannot have completely unfettered immigration access without actually stopping, taking a look at it and saying, actually, 1.3 million people over 2 years is too many.
So Ella Braverman said today's announcement isn't going to do much to stop the critics from the right. The party has lost its way in immigration, and what she says is this isn't going to kick into the spring of 2024. So it's, as it were, less than useless.
Well, I think it would have been nice, perhaps, I think looking at the statistics, we could have done this maybe a year ago and then we'd be celebrating a cut, but it's very difficult to look at data over a trend for just 1 year. You look at, for example, when Labour relaxed the immigration restrictions from Eastern Europe with Brexit, they expected tens of thousands, and you could pretty much add a big zero on the end of that. So at the time you need to assess, you need to see what the actual needs of your economy are, and we're taking action. Now, we estimate around 300,000 less people will come next year. That is almost cutting net migration in half. Now, I'd say that's quite ambitious.
Well, 300,000 fewer people coming next year. You want to grow the economy. You're going to reduce the restricted employment lists. So you're going to take off engineers, you're going to take off construction workers, maybe you're going to take off joiners and welders. These are people clearly that we do not have burnished and ready to go right now. So that will have an impact on growth, and it will have an impact on the economy.
Well,
there's a constant lack of the presenter asking, why is that too many? And if they respond because people want that or because polling says so, then asking, why do people think it's too many? Just very basic questioning is needed. Yeah, 100%, right? Although, can you feel your consent being manufactured, chat? Right now, although at least this follow-up question was reasonable, right? Again, saying, you can have this position, but there are going to be economic impacts that you are going to have to accept, right? You're going to have to accept what these economic impacts are going to be.
Jobs are actually all pretty good salaries nowadays, I would say. So there'll be many of these that would actually...
Why are British people not banging the door to take them then?
Well, this is the point, and we have far too many people in this country economically inactive at one end of the market, but we all...
Yes, because you screwed up the NHS, so they're long-term sick. In terms of the people who aren't working, who aren't long-term sick, then they're unemployed, and unemployment is at like a half-century low. Again, literally unemployment hasn't been this low since the 70s, and you all government are the ones who are banging on about this being a success, right? And I think it is actually a success. Unfortunately, capitalists don't agree because they don't want full employment.
Also, we need
Maybe
to
you
train
don't have
more
the right
people, more
training. Maybe you don't have the
apprenticeships.
right training for welders, for engineers, for joiners, for carpenters. Isn't that the problem? That we don't have the right fit to grow our economy?
And this is why we put so much money into apprenticeships, why we're looking at things such as T-levels that we brought in as well.
Yeah, you got rid of the nurses' bursary though, didn't you? Right? Bit, you know, closing the door off the horses bolted here, talking about all this investment into all of this education when you've continually had pretty restrictive budgets because of the austerity that you were running for 8 years or whatever it was, right? Again, so, oh no, I can't believe we've cut all this money out of education and suddenly we feel like we don't have an educated enough population to fulfill all these gaps in the labour market. Whoops! Right, guess we've got to fix that shit now.
And this is, of course, Tony Blair wanted to send everybody to university. Now, the downside of that is that had serious structural issues for our economy. Now, we've gone about fixing that, and we actually want a sustainable economy that just doesn't rely on cheap labour from abroad all the time.
Except that's not what we've been relying on. But even then, the idea you say, well, actually, we've been sending too many people to university, and, you know, we've not got enough people working in the trades, for example, with apprenticeships, etc. And I think any extra funding they want to put into apprenticeships is good, right? But we did the numbers on this. I remember this came up in question time, and I was looking at the John Byrne Murdoch stats on this, showing that actually, no, we do have enough people going to university. We do have enough investment in graduate level jobs for these people to do, right? When what actually has happened is that we have completely sold out our economy to the service sector, right? So we're now an entirely service-based economy and financialized economy. To the point where even graduates, because there aren't enough actual good graduate jobs because of lack of investment, are just working in crappy service sector jobs. Whereas you look at other countries who have had the increase in number of graduates that we have, but have also had the increase in graduate jobs for them to go into as well, because they've had the investment that we haven't, right? Shows that it's not too many people going to university, right? Maybe there aren't enough people getting jobs in the trades, for example, and that may be true, right? I'm glad we now have funding for those apprenticeships. But obviously that's a failure of Conservative policy up until this point. But second of all, there's just too many people working in service sector jobs rather than creating good jobs elsewhere through extra investment, both public and private.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm joined now by Richard Tice. Richard Tice, good evening. If the new Conservative group is saying that common sense has prevailed, then Tory MPs are content and James Cleverly shot your fox.
Look, this is a mass immigration crisis of the Tory party's own making. They promised to take back control of our borders. They promised to reduce immigration in the last manifesto. They've betrayed the people who voted for them. That's why so many more people are now starting to say they're going to vote for reform. But here's the point. These proposals today, they're not going to come into force until next spring. That means there's going to be a surge of immigration between now and then. But also look back at the 1990s, right? When we didn't have mass immigration, we had net immigration of about 100,000 a year. We had real wage growth of about 2.8% per annum. We didn't have a health and social care crisis. And
but we have an ageing population. We have lots of problems we didn't have 20 years ago.
That's why you need higher wages and to train our own people so that you're going to own people back into work.
Okay, so you're going to support sectoral bargaining, Richard? Are you going to support demand-side labour market reform, right? Again, this is exactly what I talk about. Every time we have this discussion, they talk about immigrants reducing wages, for example, this correlation between high levels of immigration and low levels of wage growth, when they forget that wages were growing during the new Labour years up until 2010, right? Not as much as they should have been because they didn't have enough demand-side labour market policy. But they did grow, right? Wages did grow during that period, right? People's living standards did increase during those periods. Yet, when the Conservatives come in, they maintained the high levels of immigration, right? They maintained the high levels of immigration during those periods, post-2010. Yet they implemented both supply-side labour market reform, things like benefit cuts, at the same time, and also restrictive trade union laws whilst continuing that immigration in. And then they were allowed to blame continual stagnant living standards on an increase in migration when these things weren't comparative, right? These things weren't there was no causation here. There was correlation, but no causation. Whereas the actual causation was supply-side labour market reform and stagnant wages and stagnant living standards, right? Yet because they were implementing mass immigration policies at the same time, they got to blame immigrants for the failures of their labour market policy. Like Joe Michel's done really good work on showing the ways in which they were essentially trying to use wage restraint through supply-side labour market reform as a measure of inflation control. It's a really good way of really good research that he's done. There's an interview with him on Unlearning Economics that I recommend people go and watch, right? But they deliberately depressed wages during that period, and they just blamed immigration for it. And this is how we get Brexit. It's how those people defected to UKIP, right? Because they continued immigration during that period.
Dean's right that domestic wages are way too low because we've imported cheap, low-skilled overseas labour for far too long. We've become dependent on it.
Hang on, let's be quite clear.
I've already debunked the labour market economics of that stuff, so just refer to my comments earlier.
Let me finish off on the OBR. The OBR said in the autumn statement paper just a couple of weeks ago, they said there's zero growth, and because of mass immigration, GDP per head will be falling by record levels, which proves my point. You've got to focus on your domestic population and stop importing cheap overseas labour.
You were talking up the...
There's no correlation or no causation between like falling GDP per capita and the people who are coming in and working, right? Between the increases in actual population size and a drop in GDP per capita, these things may be correlative, but they're not causative, because the people who are coming in are working and are increasing our productive capacity, which leads to increased GDP. That leads to increased GDP, right? Like, we have had dropping GDP per capita, but that's because of lack of investment and because of fiscal austerity from the government.
Idea of defections to Reform Party before today. Are we going to see any as a result
Well,
of
let's
today?
wait and see. That's obviously, I'm not going to give a running commentary on that.
Well, it's not running commentary, it's just an idea.
Yeah, look, the point is there are many Tory MPs who are furious that this government have deliberately enabled policies that have led to mass immigration. 1.25 million people in 1 year. A city the size of Birmingham last year, this year, and it'll be just the same next year.
But they're working.
We've got a record number, 5.2 million of our own people, young people, on out-of-work benefits. That's shameful, that's a disgrace. We need to train and make work pay for our own people to get our own people back into work, rather than importing cheap overseas labour and relying on that. And for businesses, for big business.
Yeah, if you want to stop relying on cheap overseas labour, then get rid of the 20% cut rule. That's the biggest problem that we have here, is this 20% discount rule on foreign labour. Like, this policy is crazily stupid, awfully stupid.
To say that they think this is a negative, rather than looking after our own people, I think is shameful.
But you talk about young people out of work, and but then you've got an issue where you can't just suddenly, as it were, turn the tap off because we don't have the skills.
We do. Look, we've got plenty of people. For too many people,
why do we need
work
engineers
doesn't
from
pay.
abroad then?
Engineers are very well paid, but we've got to train our own. We've got so many domestic people. We've got a record population. We should be training our own people in the right skills with the right apprenticeship schemes. But for too many people, work no longer pays because we've become utterly addicted to the drug of cheap, low-skilled.
No, we've been addicted to the drug of continual supply-side labour market policy, continual kneecapping and collective bargaining, which I'm sure Richard Tice does not support. I wonder what Richard Tice's opinions on trade union reforms are. I wonder what he believes would be a good fit for wage setting in our economy. I wonder what he believes would be better if we had better ways in which the workers could fight for higher wages, right? I wonder what his belief on all of those things are. I wonder. If you had all of these reforms, if you had stronger trade union reforms, all of those benefits of the additional GDP from new workers coming in would be shared much more with the people who already exist and work here, rather than all those benefits going to rich people. Just a thought.
Overseas labour, and it's time it stops.
Some people might see this as a shift by the party to the right. You know, immigration.
It's a shift to common sense, because that's what the people voted for.
Immigration is your big policy. Are you still...
Again, common sense here specifically being used as well, my opinions are right because they're common sense, because I don't have any actual facts or evidence to support them.
Guaranteeing that you won't do a deal with the Conservatives at the election?
Absolutely guaranteeing. I look you straight in the eyes, 110%, no deals. We did that last time. Frankly, I've still got the scars on my back. The British people want some common sense, and that's what we're standing for.
So is
we're
the Reform Party...
630 seats,
You're stand in 630
England, Scotland, Wales,
seats.
not Northern Ireland, absolutely.
So you'll be noticing that Nigel Farage has a profile that you would die for right now and getting bigger. Wouldn't
I don't like snakes, Kirsty.
Well, wouldn't... Well, there's lots of snakes in politics. Wouldn't you be,
the irony of Richard Tice saying he doesn't like snakes, but he has a bit of snake oil, though. Big snake oil fan.
A better position if he was your figurehead?
Look, I've often said, when people ask me exactly that question, the more help that people, the more shoulder is put to the wheel, and if Nigel decides to come back into politics, fantastic. I rather like the idea, as I said the other day, maybe we could have President Farage alongside President Trump. That would, we've got to focus on the growth and the opportunity.
So if you thought he would do your party a lot of good, you'd welcome as the leader?
I've always said I would welcome all the help, and Nigel would be a fantastic help. I'm looking forward to him getting back from the jungle.
But only the help?
All the help possible. We focus on action, not titles.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. Thank you to you all.
Well, that was awful. I was very frustrated by that, because at no point did the union leader push back on the fact that wages have been falling because of lack of trade union rights. Like, she is a trade union leader in the position to push back on these arguments by specifically saying, look, there is no correlation between increasing immigration and lowering wages, right? But what there is a correlation between is falling living standards and lack of trade union bargaining, right? This continual supply-side labour market reform that right-wing politicians love. They love this stuff. They absolutely adore these things, right? They're addicted, as Richard Tice put it earlier, to trade union reforms that kneecap the level of bargaining for workers, which has led to lower wages for people. And she was in the position to debunk this stuff by actually saying, look, as long as you're bringing people in and allowing them to join collective bargaining agreements in these specific sectors, they literally cannot undercut British workers. They literally cannot do it when you've had a sectoral bargaining agreement. She's in this explicit position to be able to make that argument, and she doesn't. Very, very frustrating. But also just a bunch of these things just not even challenged properly by Kirsty Walk. Again, saying, why do people want this? Why do people believe this? Where are these opinions coming from? Just very frustrating debate. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.